The Committee on Oversight has the broadest jurisdiction in the entire House of Representatives to investigate any topic it chooses, but we are debating legislation that denies the sky is blue, water is wet, and racism is real. The major provision of the bill says to ban anything that acknowledges racism. And a few pages later in the exact same bill, there are multiple provisions discussing the presence of racism. This Republican approach is as predictable as it is nonsensical. On one hand, they're saying that racism does not exist. On the other hand, they are saying there is rampant reverse racism. Well, how do you reverse something that never existed in the first place? Riddle me that.
All right, y'all, let's talk about this mess. The Republicans came up with a bill called the Dismantling DEI Act. And honestly, the name alone tells you everything you need to know. They really out here acting like racism is some made-up fairy tale. Like we didn't live through slavery, Jim Crow, redlining, and everything else. But don't take my word for it. Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley said it best. Watch this.
This bill, titled the Dismantling DEI Act, is an utter disgrace. Having sat and read the text in preparation for today's markup, I have yet another example to tell my constituents about the unserious work of the Republican Party. Now, I'll work with anyone serious about progress who wants to center the people who call this country home. This isn't it. The Committee on Oversight has the broadest jurisdiction in the entire House of Representatives to investigate any topic it chooses, but we are debating legislation that denies the sky is blue, water is wet, and racism is real. The major provision of the bill says to ban anything that acknowledges racism. And a few pages later in the exact same bill, there are multiple provisions discussing the presence of racism. This Republican approach is as predictable as it is nonsensical. On one hand, they're saying that racism does not exist. On the other hand, they are saying there is rampant reverse racism. Well, how do you reverse something that never existed in the first place? Riddle me that. While this Republican policy may have a new name, it's the same old tired game. Look, y'all are entitled to your opinions, but not a denial of the facts. Do you all know your history? Do you know American history? The original Constitution counted enslaved individuals as 3/5 of a person. During World War II, the federal government forcibly relocated and incarcerated 110,000 Japanese Americans. The FHA practiced redlining in the 1930s and 60s to deny mortgages to Black Americans, which is why we have a racial wealth gap today. I could go on. The GI Bill, which is supposed to be race neutral, denied access to Black Americans, denying them equal access to education and housing benefits, which is why we do not have generational wealth. Don't talk to me about merit when those Black servicemen fought for our freedoms. And I'd also just like to take a personal note of privilege to say, please keep Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s name out of your mouths. Yes. Your perversion of his words and his mission when his children have asked you to stop invoking his name and perverting his work when he was a proud and unapologetic Black man fighting for equality for Black Americans and all marginalized people. So you all are entitled to your opinions, but not a denial of the facts. But I'm not surprised that you would deny American history. What I am, though, is committed. Committed to speaking truth to power, committed to standing up for marginalized communities and vulnerable people, committed to ensuring that everyone has equal opportunity to buy a house, to work a job, to pursue higher education, and to live in a society that is fair and just. A colleague across the aisle invoked the phrase of, we must do everything to stop government-sponsored oppression. Well, I've just enumerated numerous examples, which is exactly why we have legislation and an executive order to reverse this harm. And that is why I'm committed to opposing this bill and urge my colleagues to do the same.
She did not hold back, and I don't blame her. The way they try to rewrite history is wild. Like, how are you going to say racism ain't real, but then turn around and complain about reverse racism? Make it make sense. They love to misquote MLK, but they don't want to talk about how he was fighting for racial justice, fair wages, and equality for Black people. They just pick the one quote that makes them feel comfortable. But the real problem here is that this bill is just another way to erase history and block progress. They don't want people learning about systemic racism because then they'd have to admit it's still a problem today. And that's exactly why we gotta stay loud, stay informed, and keep pushing back. Because if we don't, they'll keep trying to gaslight us into thinking oppression is just a difference of opinion. Nah, we not doing that. Next, we have to talk about this nonsense from Representative Clay Higgins. After Ayanna Pressley called out Republicans for twisting MLK's words, this man got all up in his feelings. You ever seen somebody get called out and then start yelling about freedom like they're the victim? Yeah, that's exactly what happened here. Watch this.
I appreciate my Democrat colleague for exemplifying exactly the kind of oppression of freedoms that we're referencing. How about we'll quote whoever we want to quote? How about that's my First Amendment right? That's exactly the kind of baked-in oppression. Like, how dare a white Republican quote Martin Luther King? We actually had a congressman say that just now in this committee. Well, thank you, good lady, for once again exemplifying the type of oppression that we stand against. You know I'm right. You know I'm right.
Order. Mr. Higgins has the floor.
And we will quote who we please to quote.
A disgrace.
And we will continue to speak freely because now I'm a veteran. That's the country that I serve. That's the Constitution I swore an allegiance to. And that oath has no expiration date. I will fight for it with my last life's blood. For my right to speak freely and yours, good lady. You will never hear me saying, how dare you quote anybody you please to quote. And that exemplifies, America, precisely the type of institutional oppression that my colleague, Mr. Cloud's bill, for which I'm an original co-sponsor, hopes to push back against.
But Mr. Higgins, have you read your own bill?
Have
you read your own bill? Because it is trying to regulate speech. It is actually
Ms.
regulating
Stansberry, you're out of
speech.
order. Ms. Stansberry, you're out of order.
No one's telling you that you can't quote MLK. What Pressley was saying is stop twisting his words to push policies that go against everything he stood for. Dr. King wasn't fighting for Republicans to erase history and act like racism is over. He was fighting for equity, justice, and the rights of black people, not for politicians to use one watered-down quote to make themselves feel good. Next, we have to talk about something really important that Representative Rashida Tlaib brought up. She spoke about growing up in Detroit, surrounded by black culture, and how that shaped her understanding of the struggle. But she also made a powerful point. Most people will never know what it's like to be black in America, and that's something too many folks refuse to acknowledge. Watch this.
I sometimes remind people I grew up in the most beautiful, blackest city in the country, the city of Detroit, because I need you to understand sometimes your lens becomes different when you're in a community just embodied with the constant, I think, struggle of not really, because you will never truly understand what it means to be black in America. Never. You have to acknowledge that. If you don't, I don't think we'll ever be able to you have to know. I believe it in my heart that you do. And you know, this black pastor told me, I'm sitting in the pew, of course I'm sticking out, and Pastor Bland Jr. looks at me in the audience, and I just felt like he was just looking at me, but if you're a good pastor and you know what you're doing, you always think he's just talking to you. And he said, our country is not divided, it's disconnected. And when I think about that, I think about the fact that we continue to disconnect because we allow segregation to live and breathe in a way because people are more comfortable that way, right? You hear people say, well, that's not my fault. I'm a better public servant, a better American, and everything because I went to a beautiful, diverse high school, because where I lived, that's the high school you had to go to. We all went to those neighborhood high schools. There was something beautiful, though, because I went to school with Hungarians and Polish and Latinos and black folks and Muslims and I mean, just all different kinds of backgrounds of people from all different likes. And it was something I think that many of our neighbors across the country will never, ever really experience, and I think it keeps us divided. When I think about this bill, I think about not just, obviously, the importance of diversity inclusion and trying to make sure that our government is reflective of who we serve. But many of the people we hire, it's also their lived experience. Their lived experience is going to have them lead with some sort of compassion that we'll never again have similar because we haven't lived the life that they have in our country. And I'm not just talking, I'm talking about all different backgrounds. And I just feel like we're in here talking about this in a way that I feel like is just going to continue to divide us. And the acknowledgement that everything's okay. There's no way you haven't been in spaces where you hear it. In the Michigan legislature, Chairman Comer, a man, was a minority witness in the Michigan House and used the N-word in such a derogatory word. My own state representative was in tears afterwards, thinking of her child, her beautiful, lovely son, adult son, but just thinking, my God, he thought that it was okay, that he was somehow emboldened to use that word in the people's capital in Lansing, Michigan. We have a lot of work to do. I just think this is not it. We got to make sure that we're focusing. No, really, we got to make sure that we're putting people in the room. That sometimes we got to make sure they are in the room together, because they're not going to come in the room together unless we require it or urge it to happen, because we know if we do that, then all the services, the way we move as a federal government, will be reflective in a way of leading with that compassion I think that is needed. I just urge us to please just step back and understand that. And I'm not going to tell you, I fully understand where you're. I just know that there's no way you don't know that racism is very clear in these spaces, especially here in an institution that wasn't ready for someone like me. And sure the heck sometimes isn't even ready for the American people, our own neighbors across our country, that will have to be inflicted in coming to get whatever services. God, it's something beautiful if they can look at somebody that is reflective of them and understand their lived experience. And I think we're getting farther away from that. And I know you don't see it, but I'm an attorney. I read this. You're going to allow these protections to fall apart when you do this kind of legislation. You will. It'll allow these protections to fall apart because you're going to allow people to get fired solely because you're dismantling, again, a policy and a process of creating a culture, again, that's reflective of our country.
She's absolutely right. A lot of people in power want to act like racism isn't real because they've never had to experience it. They've never had to worry about being followed in a store, pulled over for no reason, or denied opportunities because of the color of their skin. And instead of listening to the people who actually live through this every day, they just dismiss it like it's not happening. Tlaib also talked about how segregation still exists, just in different ways. And she's right. A lot of folks grow up in completely separate worlds, different schools, different neighborhoods, different realities. And when you're disconnected like that, it's easy to ignore what other people go through. Next, we have to talk about something Representative Jared Moskowitz pointed out. The Republicans claim this bill is about stopping discrimination. But if you actually read the text, they're literally creating new discrimination. Moskowitz breaks it down in a way that's hard to argue with. Watch this.
So I really have a question for the sponsor. So I've been sitting and listening and trying to hear your intent and talking about discrimination. But the problem is that argument falls apart on page 6, line 17 through line 20. And in fact, if you're sincere about your intent of the bill, what I would tell you is you should delete those lines. Because actually those lines are actual new discrimination. See, you want to get rid of an office. We may disagree with it, but you can get rid of an office. You want to change policy. We may disagree with the policy you want to change, but here actually in those lines, you are creating second-class federal employees. You're creating new discrimination. May not transfer, discrimination. May not reassign, discrimination. May not redesignate any employee, discrimination. Those are protections that every other federal employee in every other office in the federal government gets. It's a right and a privilege that they get. But you're going to remove that from these people, not an office. Fine, I disagree with it, but it's an office. Not a policy. Fine, we disagree with it, it's a policy. This is people now. Now you're going to the people. You're saying, because you worked in an office that we don't think should exist, because you worked there, we're going to remove protections that every other federal employee gets, but not you, because we disagree with the office you worked in. That is straight up discrimination. And so listen, if you're serious about wanting to change the office and the policy, you should remove those lines, because the entire argument falls apart when you want to treat the people who work there completely different than anybody else. And I'm happy to yield the rest of my time to the ranking member.
Thank you so much, Mr. Moskowitz, and thanks for that powerful statement. That was the thing that jumped out at me when I first read this. This wasn't just a change in programmatic direction. It was an attempt to strip federal workers who were doing nothing other than their job, as it was defined to them and described to them, of essential civil service protections that occur to everybody who works in the civil service. And again, there's a general regulation that deals with that. There's one specifically for veterans, saying if a veteran is working for an office, say it's one of these offices that closes, that veteran has the opportunity to be reassigned to another job that he or she is qualified for, doing not the same work, but the new work of the new office. And yet, this seems to paste a scarlet letter on them saying, you worked in now the politically incorrect, ideologically disapproved office, the reviled DEI office, and now you're going to have less rights than everybody else in the workforce. You'll be fired, and it does sound like from the author, at least they could reapply. I think it would clearly violate equal protection in the First Amendment for them not even to be allowed to reapply. But why would we set up a two-tier system where there are people who work in the federal government and then people who worked in the federal government for DEI? And it does, I think, cast a pall over the whole legislation, which obviously is touching, a lot of nerves. And, Mr. Cloud, I respect, the spirit with which you offer this legislation, and I respect the fact that you are not in denial of what so many of our members want to point out, which is that our history is one that begins, of course, with slavery and the denial of rights of African Americans. In the Dred Scott decision, Chief Justice Taney, unfortunately of Maryland, said that the African American has no rights that the white man is bound to respect. And then even after the Civil War, we fought a whole war to overthrow the system of white supremacy, to emancipate people from slavery. Still, the Supreme Court said in 1896 in Plessy versus Ferguson that it was perfectly okay for government to segregate people according to local racial customs. And we know that that means discrimination and second-class services. So the legislation you offer is part of a long history and goes back to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I'll yield back to you, Mr. Moskowitz.
Just reclaiming my time. And so I would want the sponsor to answer that question, because, look, if Donald Trump were to create a new agency, right, and years later, when we get power back, if we were to eliminate that agency or eliminate that office, but we then said those people who worked in this area of government that we disagreed with, they're going to get less rights and privileges than every other federal employee, you would be jumping up and down that we were treating Trump supporters different. And so what I'm saying to you is, if your intent is to change policy, and if your intent is to eliminate an office, we may disagree with that, but don't punish the people who work there and treat them different than everybody else, and then say this is about trying to change discrimination. I yield back.
All right, gentlemen, time's expired. I think we go back and forth.
Do you want me to answer?
If you want to answer the question, feel free.
Sure. The first thing I would say is sometimes in Washington, and this is a bipartisan issue, we can tend to think that the American people exist to support the federal bureaucracy. I do not adhere to that belief. I think the bureaucracy exists to serve the American people. Having said that, we do want our federal workforce treated right and properly and justly. I would point out that this legislation does what it upholds the Civil Rights Act. The first title it goes through and virtually says the same definitions about what discrimination is. The reason and the intent behind that is, and I'll give you one example, the Department of Health and Human Services currently has 294 DEI employees, costing the federal taxpayer about $38.7 million in taxpayer funds. Now, we can debate whether we think the program or the office has merit. My viewpoint is that for all what the altruistic purposes may have been, as some of the quotes and studies I've read, it's having even an adverse effect at best, or at best it's having a negligent effect and possibly having an adverse effect toward the stated goals. So having said that, I'm thinking, okay, in the example of HHS, we have a $38 million office that is actually having an adverse effect, and that $38 million burden shouldn't be on the American taxpayer. That's how my calculus is working. I did not, Mr. Garcia, I wish he was here because he made the comment that we were trying to get rid of DEI officers because we were going after Mr. Trump's enemies. His words, not mine. I did not view DEI officers as Mr. Trump's enemies. That was a new idea to me, a new concept that apparently he thinks that DEI officers are Mr. Trump's enemy. I think that would be an issue if they were. I didn't think that they were.
See, this is what happens when you actually read the fine print instead of just going along with the talking points. Republicans keep saying they want equality and to stop so-called reverse discrimination. But what are they really doing? Targeting specific people, federal employees, just because they worked in an office they don't like. Moskowitz is right. If you want to get rid of an office, that's one thing. If you want to change policy, fine, we can debate that. But stripping job protections from individual people just because they worked in diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI programs, that's straight up discrimination. And let's be real, who do you think this is going to affect the most? Black and brown folks. The same people these DEI offices were trying to support in the first place. So this isn't about fairness or equality. It's just another way to punish people for fighting against discrimination while pretending discrimination doesn't exist. Representative Jasmine Crockett shut this whole argument down. She broke it down using finance, common sense, and straight facts, and then called out the ridiculous way Republicans keep throwing around the word oppression. Watch this.
So many of you know that I practice law, but some of you don't realize that I actually was a business major out of Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. And the emphasis that I got in my business degree was on finance. And as I traveled the country campaigning this election cycle, one of the things that I talked about was this idea that in finance, we always promote this idea of diversity. If you know anything about a portfolio, the one thing that you want to do is make sure that it's as diverse as possible, because at times certain stocks will perform better than others, and they will exemplify various strengths and weaknesses. And together, a diverse portfolio is usually what any good finance person would promote. They wouldn't promote that you solely invest in vanilla wafers, believing that that is going to be the strongest portfolio, but instead they may want to add some chocolate cake and some Twinkies into the mix to make sure that we have the best portfolio, because there will be different preferences by different people, and again, there will be different strengths. But as I sit here and I think about what we say and what I'm hearing as it relates to diversity when it comes to anything outside of making money, and to be clear, we are losing GDP every time we try to push back on this idea of diversity, because all of us bring something different to the table. But you consistently said over and over the word oppression, and every time that you said it, it was almost as if I was hearing nails on a chalkboard, because it seems like you don't understand the definition of oppression, and I'd ask you to just refer to Google to help you out. Oppression is the prolonged, cruel, or unjust treatment or control. That is the definition of oppression. And so as I sit here as a black woman who practiced civil rights, let me tell you, the reason that my colleagues wanted to make sure you understood the same black history that your your side of the aisle wants to delete out of classrooms is because you can then misuse words like oppression. There has been no oppression for the white man in this country. You tell me which white men were dragged out of their homes. You tell me which one of them got dragged all the way across an ocean and told that you are going to go and work. We are going to steal your wives. We are going to rape your wives. That didn't happen. That is oppression. We didn't ask to be here. We're not the same migrants that y'all constantly come up against. We didn't run away from home. We were stolen. So yeah, we are going to sit here and be offended when you want to sit here and act like, and don't let it escape you that it is white men on this side of the aisle telling us, people of color on this side of the aisle, that y'all are the ones being oppressed, that y'all are the ones that are being harmed. That's not the definition of oppression. You tell me the prolonged, cruel, or unjust treatment that you've had, and we can have a conversation.
You could start with Exodus.
The final thing that I will say on this particular issue, two things. There is an article from The Guardian, and it is a little old. It's from 2021, so I apologize. But it said that back then, just 3 years ago, white men represent 30% of the population, but 62% of office holders. These are the issues that we are constantly looking at and recognizing and trying to say, is this just? I can't even tell you how many white men have served in this chamber, but I can tell you that I am only the 55th black woman to be elected to Congress. And so when you want to talk about history and pretend as if it was so long ago, it wasn't. Because again, I am just number 55. Finally, when we start to talk about what do these numbers do as we're trying to say that diversity, equity, and inclusion is the problem, the reality is that when it comes to financial performance, companies with more diverse workforces are more likely to outperform their competitors. Companies in the top quartile for racial diversity are 35% more likely to outperform their peers on profitability. Companies with diverse executive teams are 25% more likely to generate greater profits. Diverse companies earn 2.5 times higher cash flow per employee. Diversity works. And until you can show me data that says otherwise, I think that we need to go back to being a country that listens to experts and gets out of our feelings and recognizes, again, that racism is real in this country. And until we stop pretending that it's not, we will not solve the problems that we are consistently facing. And that will bring real unity that we seek when we're looking for a more perfect union.
Listen, she ate and left no crumbs. First of all, her comparison to finance? Spot on. When you're investing, you want diversity because different things bring different strengths. Nobody builds a strong portfolio by only investing in one thing, so why do they think that works when it comes to hiring, education, or government? But the real mic drop moment? When she called out how Republicans love to misuse words like oppression. Because let's be real, white men in power have never been oppressed in this country. The fact that they're even sitting in Congress right now proves that. But they want to act like they're the real victims just because they're being asked to share the table. At the end of the day, this is why people get frustrated. Republicans throw out words like oppression without even knowing what they mean. Meanwhile, black and brown folks are still fighting for basic rights, equal pay, and fair treatment. And instead of fixing the problem, they just want to act like it doesn't exist. That's a wrap on this hearing. We just saw some powerful voices speak truth to power. And let's be real. The Republicans had no real answers for any of it. They keep pushing this idea that racism doesn't exist, that diversity is a problem, and that somehow they're the ones being oppressed, but the facts don't lie. What this hearing showed is exactly why we have to stay engaged, stay informed, and keep speaking up. Because when we don't, they'll keep trying to rewrite history and block progress. But as long as we keep calling them out, they can't ignore the truth. If you like this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what you think about this nonsense. Until next time, stay woke, stay loud, and stay in the fight.